Okay, well, welcome everyone to the April 21st SIG Node meeting. Just a reminder that this is recorded, posted on YouTube for posterity, and we try to generally treat everyone fairly and with kindness. So today's agenda, I wanted to kick things off first with kind of like a general health check. I know there's a lot of things going on in the world, both personally in all of our lives as we deal with chaotic home situations in light of COVID. But then there's also probably stuff going on just in all of our organizations as folks respond. We had an issue last week that kind of raised a concern, particularly with SIG release, where some of our test jobs that were release blocking were broken for, I don't know, approximately 10 days. And I think it kind of highlighted that we maybe were too dependent on a few select heroes in the SIG and did not yet do enough to spread observability or tracking of our test jobs as broad as we should. And so what I wanted to do is kind of like take a few moments to retro here. For the past, like, I don't know, many months, we have a number of like new contributors that appear often to propose a new feature or concern. But I don't think we've done enough recently to just ensure general maintainability of what we've already done as a group, or maybe onboarded as many people as we should have. And this felt like a good example to pause and ask the group what we could have done differently or should do differently moving forward. So I put some leading questions into the SIG agenda, just to address the issue. So Aaron Krickenberger, Dims, myself, and Victor were notified that the patch releases of Kubernetes were being blocked by a job that had been failing for about 10 days. It appeared that the job was failing due to network access being blocked in the GCP project that was actually running that job. Took a bit of time for Victor and myself and Dims and Aaron to work out exactly the alternate job that might have been giving sufficient coverage but run in a different GCP project. And in the end, we moved the release blocking job to be the same as the pre-submit job. And Aaron recorded the list of actions that were taken. I think one of the things we need to do is capture owners for completing the next steps that were identified. But at a macro level, I kind of want to use this moment to pause and ask, like, are we actually able to sustain the number of test suites we are running? And do we want to think about pruning these things? And then as a group, how do folks feel about the types of carrot and sticks we can do to improve sustainability of our actual infrastructure, not just the normal cadence of getting code merged and reviewed, which I think is secondary to like ensuring that it keeps functioning. So wanted to pause here and maybe open up the floor for other folks' perspectives. And then maybe we can talk through what things we can do to kind of like scale mentorship, maybe of a unique role in the SIG, or a way to help grow stature, to just help maintain healthy operations. So I don't know, Dawn, if you want to share your perspective, or maybe others who've been longstanding in the SIG.
At least I want to share something. I think there's this particular. Can people hear me? So I keep hearing my own voice. Okay, nice. Okay, so this particular incident, I think at least there's the communication issue. So when the problem first occur, I think there's the communication. So then actually I think that I share with Derek, but maybe I had never publicly shared with the SIG. So we had some of the reorg at Google. So so we lose some of the maintainer, long-term maintainer from Google side, but we are in the process to build a new maintainer and a new contributor to the community. So we are in the process to doing so. So when this problem first occurred due to the CVE, both caused by fundamental two problems. One, it is a still the old image, which have some security vulnerability, so cause that the failure. Another one, it is due to like also is security vulnerability and deprecate. We need to change of the Kubernetes config, misconfig, and to fix that problem. So actually, our engineer, which is the maintainer, where we quickly identify the problem. So then we think about that's the good opportunity to for the new contributor and the new people can grow the experience. So we assign those issues to the new people. And there's the miscommunication. So it's not they are quickly pick up those problems. And then there's Aaron actually talked to me and talked to Nantao, talked to EG. Many people, we just kind of say, oh, we did the strategy and we did detect the problem and we issue those issues. But those communication, when he approached us and asked, that's already like during the late of the release. So we didn't really know it is become the blocker for the release. So I just want to share with this one. There's the beyond the so beyond what the direct the problem. There's the other problem. So we are still working on those kind of things to try to figure out how to grow more contributor and also how to remove all the like the unnecessary dependency on the GCP projects. And also Eric also earlier raised something like this: is that sustainable? We manage that many of the test suites, and so this is kind of we can open discussing those kind of things. But I believe we kind of the triple or maybe even not 4 times of our initial test cases. And but the problem today actually it is the problem. It is those like the release blocker issue. Those jobs actually fail, and nobody really in time to fix those problems, address those problems. That's a little bit different from like we have so many test cases, and how we are sustainable to manage those kind of things. I think we only identify a few of them as the release blocker. Maybe some people add more, but actually initially we only identify really limited site as the release blocker, not all. But those critical, like the core things, and in the past, actually, those tests identify most of the open source reliability issue. Actually, it is being failed for about like 10 days, which it is really not acceptable. So I just want to share my perspective here.
Yeah, thanks. That was good feedback. I'd like to point out that, over on Containerd side, we were definitely impacted because the GCP issue, believe it or not, hit our pre-submits, right? And in order for us to fix that, we actually just switched from using GCP for simple validation type stuff, lint checkers and things like that, to move to more like GitHub Actions as a local Containerd testing resource, or AppBear. But we still want to keep our cluster testing, right, end-to-end node type testing in GCP for now. We think that's the right place, right? So we need. I think we can definitely reduce the number of buckets that we were running off the one set of permissions in the one GCP server. I think we put too much reliance on the one path, I think, across the various projects that feed into Kubernetes.
One thing I want to add is when we first build those load E2E tests, and also we are the first SIG and define the conform test. That time actually class GKE don't have that much of the conform test end-to-end yet. So we actually the SIG, this SIG, we build those kind of things, and then later node level of the conform test expanded to the even more, like most of the node E2E test, especially conform tests, all the conform tests expanded to the cluster level. But there's the particular things because at the node level it's more deterministic. So we still maintain some of the at the node E2E as the release blocker, even it's not the conform, but it is the release blocker. And because it's hard to convert that to the cluster level and maintain of the deterministic test environment and make those tests predictable. So this is the reason we still have like the node E2E, the major
Right.
node E2E is the release blocker.
Right, right. It's more integration than a big cluster, right? For Kubernetes and other parts. And there are some cross tests that came out of node, E2E node, and went into the cluster testing, right?
Yeah. And beyond that one, then we have like the particularly like the node level component test, like the CLI, like the CRAL, like the container D. That is more like the node level test, and it's hard to build those. And also we have like the resource management related E2E test. It is really hard at the cluster level, because cluster level is like the very easy to trigger those, just like what I say, it's not deterministic. It's very difficult to maintain deterministics. So those kind of tests, we are carefully choosing those. Still, it is the release blocker. So I just want to share here, but I didn't look at the latest one. I believe people maybe add more and to the release.
So you're saying you're doing work, you have resources right now working on the E2E node tests to reduce the overall bucket size, or add more tests to it? I know it's falling behind the bucket, right?
What I just want to share the history and why,
okay, gotcha.
And the node level test, and even we put engineering resource to expand the node level conform test to the cluster level conform test. But there's still the reason we want to maintain some of the node level test as the release the blocker. So I noticed that a lot of the release blocker test still is for this release, and still actually it is reasonable to mark as the release blocker test. I just share here.
I wanted to add, this is Victor, I wanted to add one part, and that is, it seems that, on the test, we can put a test grid alert email, which should email folks when there's a test failure. And there's some echo. That is not working because I just looked at the test grid, and we had added some tests for topology manager and CPU manager, and I looked and they have been failing for 2 weeks and I'm not getting an email. And so I think if we go through some of these test jobs, especially the ones that are release blocker, and make sure that there's a party that can be emailed or notified, so we can look at it quicker instead of having someone on the release team saying, hey, you guys have been failing tests for 10 days. Why aren't you looking at it? So I think there's a problem in the infrastructure of not emailing the contacts when the test fails.
I also can share something in the past. This is kind of falling a crack after reorg or internal. So used to be like I put up a group of the people, engineer from Google. We have like on call. So this is why we don't have, I like your idea, Victor, and we should have the email notify in the long run. So we used to be like the engineer being on call, look into those node E2E tests, so we didn't fail. So it's kind of behind the scene. Many people didn't really notice, and our engineer actually regularly check off those all the like the release blocker node E2E test, and then notify each other there's the broken, and at the same time there's the corresponding release team, and I mean that's for the GKE release team. So we also make that it is part of the GKE release team, the release blocker test. So then this is kind of the working very well, but during the reorg and knowledge is being transferred, but it's not all those duties being successfully transferred. So it's some it is duty is fall into crack. Just I want to honestly, frankly share here. So we have fixed those problems, and at this moment we're looking at what kind of problem it is and how we are going to fix this problem. But I think about the one part of the problem in the past, it is just kind of a group of the engineer from Google and they took those duty. And when there's the reorg happen, which is out of the community, out of open source control, and that will fall into crack. So that's not sustainable. So this time, I think we should build those like the on-call duty or whatever, like the rotation or like the just email, and to involve community. And but I also want to share here, like the director and I talk about this even before. We want to, long time back, we want to say, oh, not just Googler to hold those duty. Can we just share among of community? The problem it is if director and I look at how many people participate of the SIG Node, and it's keeping changing. So depend on the, so that's Derek earlier also said a lot of the requests about the feature, a lot of requests about their particularly PR block, their production, and they want to review. But the fundamentally problem it is we want to build a sustainable contributor trip and group, and so then can share those duties. And so that's kind of challenging. Derek and I been talk about the back and forth many times. So we need everyone's idea and share all those kind of things, how we maintain some like core group, sustainable core group, and have the knowledge, and then we can share those kind of the duties.
So Don, I want to make sure like it's understood that it's appreciated in, at least in my view on the SIG, that Google had taken on as large of a responsibility as they had. And it's understood, like, we can all appreciate that people can get temporarily repurposed or get looking at other downstream responsibilities. I think what I'm wondering is if we can use this as a nice inflection point. So the same experience you talked about, Don, on like GKE release blocking tests, if I look at Ryan, Seth, or Victor, or any of the other Red Hatters on this call, they're aware that we have the same internal rotation, basically on the Red Hat side around our own, we call them build cops. It was basically inspired after what used to be build cop in Cube. And so I think many of our downstream activities from the core open source project are doing these similar activities. We just haven't coalesced right now into a group to do it here, and we should do that. What I'm wondering is if we could get volunteers to kind of, I don't want to say, it's not like an official working group or something, but like if we can get a set of volunteers, whether I see Jay, you commented on here, or Victor, you spoke up, to be willing to advocate internally to their organizations, as well as help us externally to just kind of like audit the state of where things are. And so that when Dawn and her team are helping mentor new participants, that mentorship is not just happening inside Google, but is happening outside to the community. But I think what we need is a clear understanding on like who's there to be involved on that handoff. And so we can take volunteers now for those who are here that are interested in maybe forming a little subgroup to kind of audit the state of testing infrastructure at SIG Node and maybe come back with a set of recommendations, or we can reach out to a mailing list, but really it takes some volunteers.
Yeah.
Apology and I are very happy to take instruction and guidance from you, Derek, and anyone else in SIG Node, and transmit that knowledge back into AWS. We're also eager to help out on the test infrastructure side. So I have had a one-on-one with Aaron Krickenberger just to learn a little bit about Prow and some of the test infrastructure systems, but I certainly would appreciate some deeper dives there.
Yeah, I would also, volunteer to help out some there. One thing I'll add, when we were looking at this last issue, I mean, there were some connectivity issues, and one of the challenges was being able to get access to that system to debug, which was pretty much shut down right away. So I think as we're going through that, that would be something to keep in mind. Can we get some kind of access to these systems to, get hands-on to debug failures when there is one to do the investigation?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in here. This is Daniel. I'm the CI signal lead for 1.19. And in relation to some of those issues with getting access to the project, I know Aaron is working on transitioning some of that over to community-owned infrastructure, which should help with that. Also, in response to the, sorry, I'm getting that as well. In response to the contributors and that sort of thing getting onboarded, we have CI Signal Shadows, which they're folks that are eager to get involved, and part of their process is learning about the test infrastructure and that sort of thing. So those are folks that, while they may not be on SIG Node right now, there are people that are interested in getting more involved with the community. Usually they're very eager, and they'd probably be open to onboarding and that sort of thing. So that may be an avenue. We obviously, from a release blocking perspective, want to help all SIGs, make sure that they have a good grasp on their test, and that also, we're reaching out in an effective way and doing good triage with them. So, we are willing to go, I guess, beyond just contacting you when your tests are failing, and also help with the effort of managing those, and also doing any work required to transition them to a more sustainable state.
That's awesome. Thanks, Daniel. I think the echo was coming from Don. So Don, just a heads up, you'll have to unmute if you wanted to speak again. Trying to think as a concrete next step, I guess, first, big thank you, Jay and Victor, for volunteering your time. I'm wondering if, as an action item out of this, the two of you could sync up, and then I'll try to join, or we can get another participant, and we'll write down some goals. But I'm kind of thinking of this as like a 119 activity to basically audit the state of our tests and then provide concrete recommendations back to the SIG in some period. Let's say, I don't know, we'll determine the period afterwards, where we can go in and start to act on this. And one of the things I'd like to do is, like, once we have that clear list identified, is we kind of need a carrot and a stick for the other types of contributions we get in the STIG. And one of the things I'm curious is if we take the output of that small working group and say, here's the needs that we need filled to meet the STIG before we can take on major new enhancements, is that too draconian of a stick? Or is it the type of thing we think we all need to do just to maintain what we're already supporting for the broad open source user base today?
I think that makes sense.
So
Yeah,
that
I'm okay.
Perfectly reasonable to me.
makes a lot of sense. And you got a couple of extra volunteers to help do some work on it too in the chat. So.
Oh, awesome. If we could, I'll record their names there.
From the chat, there's the Morgan and also Lin from Google. Say they can help.
Yeah, Morgan's in my group. He's really good, by the way, guys. We'll be welcoming him to our, the Kubernetes SIG Node area.
All right, so like all the best things in open source, we have a group of 4 volunteers together. Since Jay and Victor spoke up first, do you guys mind taking the lead to try to organize the time to get together and figure out a way to collaborate on this moving forward? And then we can pull on the list of folks who identified an interest.
Happy to. Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Are there other general topics we want to discuss around this, or do we feel like this is a good next step for an action plan? And then maybe we can reach out to the mailing list to see if there are others who can assist who were not able to meet today.
There are more people from the chat to jump in to want to contribute. So yeah, I appreciate it. There's Saren, David, and David and Ning from the Google GK team, the new team. Earlier I mentioned the reorg. Actually, they came from the new team, so they would love to help too. And Saren, sorry, I don't know where you came from, but Saren also volunteered to help.
That's
yeah, so many
Balaji.
people, yeah.
I'm from AWS.
Yeah, many people want to help. So I think that we start from the SIG Node mailing list. That's good enough. I will share also some like old document and written by Yuji and about how we categorize of the node ETE. And I think that we still try to maintain some of those kind of things because it's still relevant to our release reliability and quality. So I will share those, reshare those documents through the Kubernetes SIG Node after this meeting, and we can maintain those things. We can evolve from there. Let's just give you some history.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like we have a plan, and a big thank you to the volunteers who raised their hands today. And hopefully we can learn from this and come back with a start recommendations that we can execute on to avoid similar problems in the future. With that, I guess we can talk around the other two topics. So it looks like Balaji, you had the topic next.
Hey, hi, yeah. So not many of you might know me, so I just want to give a quick introduction. So I'm Balaji, I'm from AWS team. I'm part of EK from the beginning itself. And we also have Jay, who is working with me on these two PRs. So Jay is a principal engineer in AWS EKS. So it just gets started. So I wanted to talk about the first one is like the plugin support for the pod admission handler. So we discussed this in the past as well in the SIG Node meeting. So one of the conclusion was to write, was to come up with a plugin support for the pod admission handler. So the reason being like we as a cloud provider, like we support a nodeless or a serverless nodes for Kubernetes cluster itself. So where we spin up a Fargate instance when customers ask for a pod to be spin up in their cluster on which they don't want to manage the nodes for. But the Fargate nodes doesn't support few things like you cannot have host networking, and you cannot have any of the EBS volumes or a persistent storage volumes attached to your pod. So one of the issues that we faced in the past was like, how do we restrict such pods? Because with EKS or with any other cloud providers, like the customer, they have or the Kubernetes users, they have administrator access to the cluster. So even if we create a PSP or even if we have a validation webhook that's rejecting the pod, like they can still go ahead and delete this validation webhook or the PSP and get their pods launched on these nodes. So in order to like fully block these nodes from running on those serverless platform, like what we came up with, like adding a plugin on the node itself that kubelet invokes to say whether this particular pod can be admitted or not, because seems like having the check on the kubelet is like the last minute check that can be performed, because if you added anything on the controller side, like the administrators can go ahead and delete those and have the pods eventually running on those kubelets. So that's the discussion we had in the past. And then this PR, like whatever I posted now as an updated doc and as updated notes from our previous discussions. So this one talks in detail about how we are going to implement this particular plugin in the kubelet code. So the approach that we went with this was similar to the CNI, how CNI works. So there will be like a configuration file in a specific folder, and this configuration file has the list of plugins that needs to be invoked, and kubelet has a feature flag. I added a feature flag called pod admission plugin. And when the feature flag is enabled, I was saying that we will call the admit method of this pod admission handler shim that will be added in the kubelet package, and this admit method will invoke the external plugins. So do you have any questions so far?
I'll just, thanks, Balaji. I'll just add that we tried to be as upfront as possible and sort of tell the story about how the EKS team in trying to design support for the Fargate nodeless computing platform with EKS. We went through a sort of decision-making and R&D process, like how do we protect the host control plane, for lack of a better word, for that is completely managed from the Kubernetes users that have Kubernetes administrative access to the cluster. So if you remember from the last time we talked about this, I remember Derek, you'd said, you know, why not just use pod security policies or OCI hooks, et cetera. And we had discussed a lot of those solutions, and we sort of outlined in the motivation here those different alternatives and why we ended up where we did. So tried to be as open and transparent about the decision-making process as we could be, so folks don't think that we're coming at this from a, like, you know, we're trying to sneak anything in or anything like that.
Yeah, so I remember us discussing this a few months back. I have not had an opportunity to read the latest update to the doc, but it sounds like a lot of positive updates had been made. I guess there's a couple action items we need to take out of that. One, like, I think a group of us need to get up to speed on what the latest proposal was. And then if we map this back to the previous topic and maybe timeline goals, is there a particular timeline that Jay and Balaji, you guys were trying to achieve?
No. I think that primarily, you know, this is code that we will keep having to patch right into our Kubernetes versions, and that's perfectly fine. So it's more of a long-term technical debt reduction that we're aiming for here by upstreaming this functionality. But there's no specific timeline. And to your point earlier about, you know, contributing bug fixes and the fetching the wood, carrying the water type activities, you know, that's certainly more important. But yeah, this is something that we needed to do to resolve our sort of split control plane issues with Fargate, and think that we've come up with a solution that's extensible and upstreamable. So we're really just looking for some feedback, and in particular, if anyone can think of any alternative to what we've landed on.
So I do have like an open question that I wanted to ask. Like, let's say if we wanted to implement this plugin support. So if you see the doc, like, and if you search for the word like socket or something, like I provided like 3 options to say how the pod admit handler shim can talk to the external plugin. It can be either to a shell or through a gRPC stream or through a gRPC server or through a Unix socket. Like which one does everybody feels like comfortable doing it? If in case if we go with this approach, like, do you feel like just the shell should be enough, or should we have a gRPC or a Unix socket? The only reason why I thought a gRPC server or a Unix socket would be useful is we don't have, like, we establish the connection once and then we can just use that connection and keep sending the request and get the response. And we don't have to like encode, decode the response if you have the shells, because that's what CNI plugin does today. Like it exports everything as an environmental variable and then reads the response back, right?
Yeah, so Balaji, it's possible you're further ahead in your thought on this than I am. I'm still trying to quickly skim through your latest updates.
Yeah, no problem, Derek. Maybe we can discuss in the next meeting.
I guess the thing I'm just curious about is I assume you lifecycle your plugins as you lifecycle your OS image.
You mean with respect to the node itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we do have a separate one, but that's managed by the service team itself. So as a Kubernetes administrator or a user, like we don't have any lifecycle for the OS image.
That's that split control plane that we're referring to.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I understand.
yeah.
I guess
Gotcha.
I was just trying to think through like
Were you wondering if we can sort of like hot replace plugins? If that was sort of on the horizon for us?
I just trying to think through like all the things that we hit with things like device plugins, where just understanding on where and how you intended this plugin to be lifecycled, and if it's lifecycled separately from like a traditional node lifecycle operation where you drain and do some maintenance and maybe, you know.
Right. The pattern that we're following here is really as close as possible to the CNI setup. And granted, I'm familiar with the pros and cons of that particular plugin system, but we figured it was prior art, and we'd sort of stick to that well-worn path.
So the thing with CNI is like the kubelet will report it's not ready until it has a plugin. And so I guess that's the only other question I would have on this is like, did you have
right?
I'm ready.
Although there is a, one of the issues with that particular sort of strategy is when you're upgrading the CNI plugin. So if kubelet thinks that a CNI plugin is active because it sees the file in the, whatever it is, etc CNI netd file or directory, then it just considers it to be active. But if you replace that plugin file, it doesn't really know. You need to restart the daemon or whatever. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can query for the status of CNI plugins that were used at the innate of a pod. So we should be able to get that information, but it may not be the same for all container runtimes because that's like augmented information in the stats.
Yeah.
We can talk after if you like. Ping me, Mike Brow on Brown WM. I'll check.
So Derek, I guess that's a good question. Like whether what happens if the plugin is not available, or what happens to the kubelet status when it is coming up. Yeah, I didn't think through that one yet because in my mind, I thought like the plugin should already be existing on the node itself. But if it's like similar to CNI plugin where if the customer does it through a daemon set pod, then what happens, right?
Yeah.
I'll think through that. I'll update the doc accordingly.
Yeah, I just recorded some of these on your PR so that my future self remembers smart things my past self might have asked.
Yeah.
I don't know if others had thoughts on this, or should we just allow time to read your updates, and thanks for notifying, and we can adjourn on it in the subsequent meeting?
I have a quick question. So what happens if this plugin rejects the pod because of some feature is not available? So what happens next?
Do you mind repeating your question? Like what happens when?
Well, you get the pod which, let's say, uses the persistent storage, and your admission plugin says like, no, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What happens in this scenario?
Oh, so let's say like the plugin is going to respond to say that this pod cannot be admitted because it requires a EBS volume or any other persistent volume. Then this pod admit handler will read the response, and similar to how other pod admit handler returns a admit result, this pod admit handler shim also will return a result saying that with a reason code saying unsupported pod spec, and then with a message, and then with a Boolean flag admit set to false, then the kubelet automatically rejects the pod. If any of the admit handler says that they cannot admit this pod, then the kubelet rejects the pod. And then the pod gets, so if it's like part of a replica set or a deployment, it gets recreated.
Alexander, does that answer your question or?
Not really. So practically what we have, like we have a pod which was scheduled by the scheduler assigned to the node. Node rejected that pod. So now we have a race between the node and the scheduler where this pod needs to be recreated.
Oh,
Or at least we need to have a status which says like this pod needs to be recreated because it cannot be like the decision what scheduler made is actually not correct or not acceptable for the node. So we have exactly the same scenario when we had a discussion about the topology manager where the topology constraints might not be satisfied in the kubelets.
Right. So Alexander, like this is built on top of assuming that they either have a PSP or a validation webhook, and this is like the last minute check. Like if the users has deleted, if the cluster administrator has deleted the PSP and then the validation webhook as well, then if the pod gets created and scheduled on to this particular node. So let's say if the node rejects this pod and then if the pod gets deleted, the next node when it comes up, like hopefully we will have the automation to recreate the PSPs or the validation webhook so that the scheduler knows that it either, if the pod is created, then the scheduler knows that it should not put the pod onto that node again because of the PSP. Otherwise, if they have the validation webhook, then the pod creation itself will be rejected.
I think perhaps Alexander is just asking how the kubelet will reject, like some specificity there, like that it'll add a condition object into the pod status conditions collection that explains why it was rejected and puts it into a particular state. Is that what you were getting at, Alexander? Or?
Yes. So the thing is, what like kubelet need to put a pod in the state what says I need to reschedule it to somewhere else. But like that's one side of the story. But while we were discussing, I got another idea. What was, well, maybe stupid questions. Like, have you guys considered to use the scheduler extension? So practically, like the plugin to the scheduler, which will not put this like bad pods to your node.
An extension with an extension state for the failure for the pod.
No, the pod will not arrive to the kubelet if it's done on the scheduler extender.
Basically, it's like last couple, what Alexandra is suggest is like last couple meeting, we talk about topology, right? NUMA a while scheduling. So this one, it is more like all the security, node security level or security context support level, whatever things like that, or maybe node feature level of the awareness, build those awareness into the scheduler at the first place. And then you basically, it is reduce amount of node level will like the mismatch between the scheduler and the node level. So then you don't need to actually deploy node level admission control pod and to do those kind of things. So this is actually the node level admission control is complicate the whole thing, everything. And if we can build that into the scheduler using the scheduler extend framework, we basically don't need to do this.
So I think that's probably true in many situations, except probably
if the cluster administrator can,
right? If the cluster admin can bind a pod to a node, they're trying to basically
or launch a custom scheduler.
So in that cases, why don't just like how we handle off the PVC, and then you have the controller and you can bind upfront doing that once you assign that one, and then you just quickly, if you have that knowledge, know the level of the knowledge, and you say, oh, this node, I want to assign this job and ask for something, but it is not bound to the node yet. So then you have the controller to do this bounding. And at the same time, and then you make sure that bounding finished, and then the pod schedule on that node. Instead, you deploy off the node level admin control and they say, oh, actually you don't bound, and reject it. Have we ever looked at some other?
So there is actually a separate scheduler for Fargate, and it does a little more than scheduling. It does sort of like lifecycle management of these composed nodes, right? Because they're not real nodes. They're sort of like, you know, auto-created nodes. I think the concern there, and perhaps Balaji can remember this from our discussions, but I think the concern there was because the Kubernetes cluster administrator has the ability to launch additional scheduler plugins and/or control the scheduling layer. That wasn't a level of security that was acceptable, I guess, for the.
So it's like when they have their own scheduling.
I'm sorry. I just want to. I'm curious on a parallel situation though. Let's say every pod that's run in this environment is I'm trying to think about how the intersection of this with the node authorizer. So did you have any other secondary desires to restrict who can, is this one node for all scenarios? Are there n nodes being presented to the cluster, or
for each pod? So for each pod with a scheduler type of Fargate, a node is composed by the scheduler / lifecycle manager for these nodeless environments.
Okay, and then that composed node would have the same restricted access to secrets as any other node in the cluster, meaning secrets that have been.
Yeah, Balaji, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's based on names. There's like a way to pin it to a particular namespace with the Fargate profile thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So we launch the nodes based on the namespaces that we get access to create the Fargate nodes.
I see.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, Dawn, I completely understand your reticence to, you know, not add this level of complexity into the entire communication between API layer and node. I think at the end of the day, it was just the security stance of having these composed nodes have a control plane that is under no circumstance able to be examined by the tenant, overrode any decision to have any control of these security-based policies at the API layer. And I guess we kind of consider the scheduler to be the API layer, for lack of a better place to put it.
Yeah. Okay. The reason I share this one is just a long time ago when Google supported TPU, and we doing something similar. And behind this thing, they have the controller compose the node and compose those accessible to those TPU device. So then, but we don't change of the Kubernetes like as the open source upstream, because that's kind of, at least from my side, that's because it exposes extra complexity and also more surface area to community. Not everyone will benefit by this feature, but actually the trade-off for the overall community for everybody. So that's why we spend the extra time to compose those nodes behind the thing and deliver that to the customer. So I just want to share this one. That's a couple of years ago. I'm the one actually before propose anything to the community. I already pushed back. I said, no, let's just do something more complicated. Just share here.
One other thing we might want to consider is how this interacts with something like config map based kubelet config. It seems like we've been under the assumption for a long time now that cluster admin sort of owns the nodes as well. They own the node objects, and there's a lot of echo. Sorry. And so I think this is going in a different direction than we've gone before. I have one just general question, just because I'm not sure how Fargate works. Is this a CRI? Like, what's the interface at which you guys plug into Kubernetes? Is it the
Containerd?
Containerd. Okay, so this is like a runc ish.
No,
Okay.
it's like a auto host management, like composed host type functionality. I don't know how else to describe it. You know, it's definitely not at the CRI level or
Okay.
OCI level, and it's sort of somewhere in between kubelet and I don't know, whatever, you know, and like node controller. It's sort of something in between there, right?
Okay.
Where you've got a different tenant or a different set of users that are creating these nodes and managing these nodes automatically. And those tenants are not the cluster administrator. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, have you tried to use virtual kubelet for this?
Yes.
Oh, well, okay.
Yeah, there was a previous effort, actually, I think almost 2 years ago at this point, that tried to get virtual kubelet to work, and it didn't work for a number of other reasons. So this was the solution that we ended up with. So
yeah. So maybe like how about like just take like a quick look at the PRs and then we can discuss next week or then in the next meeting whenever there's time permits to see what other changes or whether modifications are required or if this is even acceptable.
yeah, I think any and all feedback on the PR would be awesome. Dawn, you know, getting your feedback on the project that you'd mentioned earlier, internal to Google with TPUs, would be awesome to get that feedback on the CAP.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I will take a look. I have to admit I didn't look at. I don't recall. I read this proposal fully. So. Yeah.
No worries.
Thank you.
Okay, I know there was a topic on the agenda. I don't know if we can cover it in 3 minutes. Also see the comment from Mike in the chat around sidecar work group status.
Is there a work group, I guess, being put together? Or, you know?
You're referring to sidecar containers?
Yeah, to move it forward with respect to the, you know, the pod finalization type issues around sidecar.
Yeah, so I know, I don't know if Mernal is here. I know Mernal met with, I had met with Tim Hawkin to try to recruit some folks to address termination of a pod and the sequence order to terminate containers in that pod when just a user powers off a computer. And I personally view that as a prereq to moving sidecar containers forward, because all the production readiness reviews in the world are making it clear to me that people use Kubernetes in ways that I didn't anticipate. And so if we're going to start adding shutdown sequencing, I want us to to do shutdown sequencing in a way that'll work whether you're using spot instances or any of the other things on clouds. So Tim had graciously found some folks at Google who were interested in this, and I know at the Red Hat side, Mernal was interested in supporting container shutdown sequencing so that kubelet could know when a host is being powered off. I believe they met. I believe they met.
Okay, good.
Last week. I was unable to join them. But what I would recommend, Mike, is if you are willing to help out in that space, reach out to Mrinal Patel, and he can tell you the groups of folks in SIG Node who are starting to explore it.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to bring up. So I think it'd be really useful if we had like a concrete list of prerequisites for doing this work. I totally understand and respect not wanting to do this before we have, the groundwork cleaned up. But, this is a super important feature for a lot of people. So we're very willing, I think, to get people to do things that will unblock this. So we, like right now, just like on the outside, I don't really know what those blockers are. So I can't help unblock them, right? If we had like a list of, we want to clean up this, and this is how we do it, I think it would be super useful for everyone involved.
Yeah, so particularly on a functional point, I believe I put that comment on the KEP as well as in the feedback on this particular enhancement that was given to the community, which was introducing new types of containers is a high bar in my view. And when those containers come down with termination sequencing, it's only proper that we get it right as early as possible in an alpha state, because we're seeing 57% of users in the world are using alpha features in production. So that's concerning to me. Then to the earlier point on, I think this is a good counterpoint to say, like, there are features that are important to a lot of communities. I know this is particularly important to certain networking communities. But we spent the first half hour of this call talking about how we're having trouble just keeping the lights on the SIG. And so maybe Howard or Mike and others, this is a good time to jump in and help Jay and Victor organize just like what will be the test infrastructure to keep this thing going on forward, because we've grown a lot of features, but then we need to tend them after. So just ending the call on the same point we started the call with, which is like, maybe we need to figure out those carrots and sticks better. Anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing I do just before we leave is it's becoming intern season. So there's potentially a lot of interns involved in, various projects. If this is a type of thing that could be benefited from, throwing 5 or 10 interns in different areas, please let us know. I think like Istio, I know, has a lot of interns that are planning to work in the area that could potentially help out here as well, because obviously this is a huge feature for us. So yeah.
Yeah. So let's see what comes out of the exercise that Jay and Victor will arrange on just test infrastructure, and then maybe we can, if there's interns available to the community, we can balance the engagement. But I'm really reticent to take on a ton of new things, given that the impact we had to the community was potentially blocking a Z-Stream release.
Yeah.
And to me, that should be like a wake-up moment for us. And I'm happy to push back because I think it's in the best interest of Kubernetes as a whole that we take this as a moment to reassess.
I totally support, just echo what Derek said here. I also want to mention that earlier I did mention something. One concern it is we used to have a stable team, like the sustainable and maintain those kind of things. But that's because it's the company, one company. So to maintain the test status. So due to the reorg, we lose that one and we have to rebuild. This time we really want to build that sustainable team from the SIG Node, which is kind of the So intern, we love the intern, and we got a lot of work done by the intern in the past. But for the sustainability and the maintenance and all those kind of things, I would rather have like the build a sustainable team. And I understand that people come and gone, but we need to have like the process, and even like the team and the people come and go, but still have like the process build there, can left and can rebuild the team to maintain our test. So to just put the intent, just simply say, oh, this is the like the put the intent to fix one day failure test. Next time we have the same problem, we maybe next release we run into the problem and you will fix the test today.
Okay. Well, by the way, a big thank you to all of us who joined today, and we'll post the recording once Zoom catches up and makes the recording available to post. And big thank you to Jay and Victor and Morgan and Ning and David and Daniel for all raising their hands to help us out. And I will talk to you all again next week. Bye, guys.
Thank you, Derek. Thanks, Don.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
Cuba.
Bye, guys.